Well, welcome once again. This is the Doctor of Digital podcast. The purpose of the show is to transform your business and life with education and inspiration. I introduce busy people to trends in writing ideas and improving your life by highlighting people you should know. Have you ever felt like you're meant to do something more with your life, but you're not quite sure what it is? Sebastien de Castell, author of the acclaimed swashbuckling fantasy series, The Greatcoats, and the YA fantasy series Spellslinger, has certainly had his fair share of career changes. From archaeology to music, ombudsman to fight choreographer, Sebastian's path to becoming a writer was anything but traditional. But what drives someone to pursue so many different passions, and how do they all come together in his writing? With a background in archaeology and a degree in hand, Sebastian might have seemed destined for a life of dusty digs and ancient artifacts. But after just 4 hours on his first dig, he realized that archaeology wasn't for him. Instead, he went on to pursue a wide range of careers, from music to interaction design, fight choreography to product strategy. And yet, despite his many talents and accomplishments, Sebastian's writing is what brought him the most recognition and acclaim. His two series have been shortlisted for numerous awards and have been translated into over a dozen languages. During this episode, we'll do a deep dive into the changes and hot topics of visionary writing and its biggest challenges. I will leverage the expertise of my guest and how to navigate the unique dynamics of the field. By the end of this episode, you'll be better equipped to know what to do, and I encourage you to contact my guest and get his books, Sebastien de Castell, author of the Greatcoats and Spellslingers. With that, I want to welcome Sebastian to the program. How you doing this morning?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Mick.
You bet. So it's great to have you. Thank you for taking out some time for your busy writing schedule. But people are always very interested in background of writers. So you've got a unique story. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got to be a writer in the first place?
Yeah. So there's the long version and the short version. Probably the shorter version is better. I was working as a full-time musician in a cover band, touring small towns all over the province of British Columbia, making $250 a week, playing Brown Eyed Girl 3 times a night, uh, and being sued by the bass player over control of this terrible band with this not very impressive business, because it's just one of those odd circumstances where you're in a band and all of a sudden you're just no longer, there's so much tension and pressure, you're no longer kind of getting along. And so I was, so when you get a lawyer's letter saying the bass player is taking control of the band and will take you to court if you don't agree, and over a cover band, you could say you're at kind of a creative low in your life. And so I did what I always do when I find life confusing, which is I went to the library. And because, you walk into a library and it's like a cathedral of sort of humanity and human knowledge, right? You can explore anything you want. No one's ever going to tell you shouldn't be looking at this. You're not qualified to look at that. Libraries are these sort of magnificent things, right? And I found a box of cassettes in one of the sections on an upper floor that was a box of cassette tapes, and it was called Let's Write a Mystery by Ralph McInerney. And Ralph McInerney was a mystery writer. He was also a professor, I think, at Notre Dame in the United States. Right. And he wrote the Father Dowling mysteries, these kind of religious mysteries. I'm not a religious person, but I was just intrigued. And inside the box, in addition with all these cassette tapes, I had to literally go find a cassette player. This is like the very late 90s, but even then I had to try to find a cassette player. But also inside the box was the manuscript that he was writing while he's recording the tapes, telling you how to write. And it was this first draft of a mystery novel that he comes up with on the fly as he's recording these tapes, to telling you what to do. And it was possibly the worst novel I've ever read. And which was amazing, because this guy, Ralph McInerney, was, a quite legendary writer, a very talented, skilled writer. And so for someone to reveal to you, what it looks like when they just sit down and do their first terrible draft of a book, that will later become a really great book, was really the key for me, I think, of unlocking that really primal necessary instinct for writers, which is the instinct to, I'm just going to write, I'm just going to let it go, I'm going to let it out, I'm not going to judge myself, I'm going to trust, sorry for a cattail whipping by periodically, I'm going to trust that I can do something with it afterwards, that there's more than one mode for writing. You don't have to put out beautiful, perfect words on the first go. And so I took that home and I wrote a very terrible mystery novel that completely kind of changed my life because it gave me all of the wonderful things that you get from writing your first novel. And a lot of people, I think, don't understand this, that you don't need to write your first novel for money, and it doesn't really have to even be a hobby, because the process of writing your first novel is like the process of training for your first marathon, right? It's transformative. Your brain becomes just bigger. You can hold bigger, more complicated thoughts than you could before. Certainly I could. It helped me get promoted in other jobs because everything just seemed simpler after having written a first entire novel. And people became more interesting to me, because when you're creating characters, you're learning to develop a certain empathy for other people. So people who would otherwise have annoyed me on first meeting them in the past would suddenly be more interesting to me. And so it was just a really wonderful process. And so, but honestly, at the time, after I finished it, I thought, that's great. I got what I needed out of this process. Now I can move on to something else. As you mentioned in the intro, I'd done all these different kinds of careers, and I love just navigating different kinds of fields and careers. I thought, well, that was okay. I'm done. But then a few years later, there's a thing called a 3-day novel writing contest every year. It's been around for over 45 years, I think, where in 3 days, people try to write a novel or some piece of a novel. And usually they write about 10,000 words or something, and they usually come with an outline. I decided to do it the very last minute, had nothing prepared, just all the stories that have been building in my head as I over the years, whenever I go running to entertain myself, because I'm a lousy runner. And I got up that morning. I didn't even start at midnight, which most people do. I had a nice night's sleep, got up at 7:30 in the morning. And over the course of those 3 days, I wrote 44,000 words of a novel that at the time was called Three of Traitors, which was probably a terrible name. And years later, when I revised and expanded, it became Traitor's Blade, which was my debut novel, got me my first 4-book deal with a major publisher, which led to an 8-book deal with another publisher, which led to another 4-book deal, which has led to 8 more book deals since then. So all because I was being sued out of my cover band and needed inspiration.
Well, it's a great song nonetheless, but sorry
Yeah.
about the suing part. But yeah, I could play Brown Eyed Girl a number of times and listen to it. But I understand that. I'm curious about maybe a couple of things you could say, like what was the process of finding a publisher? Could you tell us a little about your writing and when you write? Because writers are always interested. Are you a morning writer? Are you an afternoon
Mhm.
writer? Do you write after the bustle of the day? When do you write, and what's the publishing process like?
Sure. So, so, so getting an agent, I reflect back on this quite often, because getting an agent, a good agent, is harder, I think, than getting a publishing deal. And I say this because once you've got a good agent, you've got someone who knows how to navigate the waters, who's already got the connections, and they don't sign you as a client unless you have a manuscript that they think is going to sell.
Mm,
So, when my agent signed me, and I adored working with Heather, she's retired now, but when she signed me, she already knew like which publisher she thought
right.
I should be placed with, which was the legendary Joe Fletcher, who Joe had edited a lot of the greats, Ursula Le Guin and I think Scott
Mm.
Lynch, and all kinds of just terrific writers. In fantasy and science fiction, and so it's actually, once you kind of get your agent, it's more harrowing an experience, because as soon as you get your agent, you think the next day you're going to get the book deal, and so that process of waiting becomes really uncomfortable, because you already felt like you succeeded, and now you're
Yeah.
just not sure what's going to happen. But I do think it's actually harder these days to get a good agent. The last thing in the world you want is a bad agent. And you have to remember that often people who who are willing to sign you, who are agents with what appear to be very major agencies, might actually be interns who literally were just told, okay, you're ready. You eat what you kill. So if you sign somebody and they make money, then you'll make some money. Otherwise, you're still basically working for free. And folks like that aren't really in a very good position to take care of you. Now, some of them are going to be terrific, just as anybody who's starting out. Some of the people who are just starting out are going to be terrific, but you really have to research your agent.
Okay.
You can't just sign with anyone, because there's also people out there that are trying to take advantage of writers, not necessarily intentionally, but any agent that's offering you paid services is not really a good agent for traditional publishing. It doesn't mean that they don't have something to offer. It just means that if you're thinking of traditional publishing, I don't know anyone who would pay money to an agent.
Mm.
I think it was Harlan Ellison or someone who said all money should flow to the writer, and that tends to be true. So that was and I was very lucky in getting my agent. I started out by sending out, I think, a dozen query letters. I don't think any of them came back with anything other than form rejections. It was my wife, who's a librarian, who was at a dinner where the then head of Penguin Canada and Penguin International happened to be, and they were chatting, and his wife was starting a new literary agency. And they got to chatting, and he liked the sound of it. And then Heather, wrote to me and said, "I've heard about this manuscript. I want to see it." And then I sent it to her. And 3 weeks later, she said, "I'd like to sign you." And it was absolutely wonderful. We're still friends. She's retired, but when Christina, my wife, and I go to London, we'll always go see my old agent. She's not old, but she's retired. My previous agent, Heather, and her husband. So that was that part of the process.
So, having written now a number of works, and a lot of writers are very interested in your process. And I guess one of the things that comes down on is, okay, now you're a writer, right? So you've moved into this as your career. So does that put a lot of pressure on you? In other words, now you have to write. So the difference between writing for myself and for just the expression, like you said at first, you were just writing because you wanted to write your first bad novel.
Mhm.
Now, what's the process like, and when do you write? Because do you feel pressure to be a writer now? Because now that's what you are.
Well, I've had 16 novels published now. So you would think that after 16 novels, you would think that, one, I would have a process, and two, I wouldn't constantly feel that strange pressure. But in fact, I have, my process is all over the map. I don't have anything that resembles the kind of, rigorous structure that I hear a lot of other novelists talk about.
Mhm.
And maybe that could be reassuring for your audience, in that it's okay if you're all over the map. Every book I write follows a different process. I'll give you a couple of examples. So my first book I mentioned, was the first draft of that was written in a mad sprint over the course of 3 days. It was every good idea I had about swashbuckling stuck together, right? The second novel in that same series, Night's Shadow, was, I wrote a 40-page outline for it. It was written over, a year and a half. It was a longer process. It was a more rigorous process. It was a more complicated book. But then, recently, I've got two books here in a series of mine called, one of my new series called Court of Shadows. And actually, I'll show you this one. But recently, for example, so Play of Shadows, which is a swashbuckling fantasy set in the theater. I wrote the first draft of this as a screenplay, not because I write screenplays. I've never been I never wanted to be a screenwriter, except to one day write Hallmark Christmas Prince movies. That I definitely want to do. But other than that, I never wanted to be a screenwriter. But I wrote it as a screenplay because I was thinking I need to think about locations, and I need to think about dialogue in this, and that was a good way to do it. So I wrote, I think, 3 of the 4 acts as a screenplay in a long afternoon, and then spent like 2 or 3 years writing the actual book. Whereas Malevolent Seven, which is a book that was a recent was really successful for me. This one I wrote in February of 2020, literally like at the beginning of the pandemic, because I was in a bad mood. And I thought I had just finished writing the 6 Spellslinger novels, which are young adult, and it was a contract where it was 8 books over 4 years, so 2 books delivered every year, in addition to anything else I was writing. And because it was YA, the language was getting more and more policed every 6 months, because that just happened to be what was happening in the world at the time. People were becoming more and more concerned about, what language is appropriate and not appropriate. But for a writer, that's really uncomfortable, because you're sort of like, wait, this word was fine in book 1, and now it's not okay in book 3. And it's not the fault of any editors or proofreaders. That's just how the culture is evolving. But I was finding myself feeling incredibly kind of constrained, and once you become a professional novelist, you become more aware of what people are saying about the
Yep.
field of fantasy literature online and in the media. And so it becomes all these voices, and they're shouting down your internal creative voice. Even I get a lot of letters from readers, which I love, but you get letters from readers saying, please, please never kill off this character, or why hasn't this character found a girlfriend or something? And those voices, even the people who say, oh, I love how you do this, I hope you keep doing this, that's also shouting down your own creative voice if you're not
Sure.
careful. So I decided to do a kind of a palate cleanser novel, because you mentioned before, right? You go from writing for yourself to writing for other people. And when you
Hmm.
become a professional, when you sell your first novel, the last thing you think of doing is writing a novel for yourself again, right? And I went, no, screw it. I'm writing a novel in a month. It was a short month. I'm going to write everything I feel like writing. I'm going to use all the bad words. I'm going to not explain the magic system. I'm going to refuse to follow any of the rules people think of as rules of fantasy. And I wrote this manuscript called Malevolent Seven, which was, every fantasy writer at some point, I think, wants to write the Magnificent Seven, but with wizards.
Sure.
And so I wrote, my sort of notion of the Magnificent Seven, but with wizards blowing stuff up and swearing constantly. And my agent Heather at the time asked, what I was up to, and I said, oh, nothing. I'm just writing this novel for myself. And she said, oh, I'd like to read it. And I said, sure, but it's not anything worthwhile. And she read it, and then she said, oh, this is great, I want to sell it. And I said, are you crazy? You can't sell this book. It's terrible. Well, not because it's a terrible story, but it's violating all of these conventions that are
Mhm.
very kind of prevalent right now. And she said, okay, fine, if you think so. And so then she was retiring. She passed me on to my new agent, a guy named John Wood, from RCW Literary in the UK. And John said, oh, I've heard about this manuscript, Malevolent Seven. Could I read it? I said, sure, but you're wasting your time on it. And he read it, and then he said, oh, I like this. I really want to sell it. And I said, this is ridiculous. Like, nobody's going to buy this book, but go ahead. And it was the fastest book sale I've ever made. And then it became this kind of reasonable sort of fantasy hit book. Um, so you have these contrasts between a book that I might spend a couple of years writing, that
Right.
might get great reviews and might sell pretty well, but not necessarily set the world on fire. And then a novel that you write in a month, where you're just letting it out, whatever's driving you, that suddenly ends up being a hit. So, yeah. So when you say, do you have a process, a particular time, a particular way? I kind of laugh because, yeah, I'm a complete mess, but I'm a complete mess that, has had 16 novels out, and I have 9 more books under contract.
And this is what I find so fascinating, but reassuring for writers also, right? So that rather than being pressured to be a writer, you are simply allowing your brain and your writing skills to come out. So you're not inhibited. So that's what one thing I would say about, I think, the fantasy genre in one set. Of course, that's what fantasy is. You have to let creativity emerge, and it comes from all different places, and it comes out in all different ways. So I'm curious then, what's the like the wellspring of creativity? Since it's all fantasy and there's a lot and it's number of novels, where do your ideas come from? Do you base it on real life characters? When you mentioned earlier, it's like you
Mhm.
start paying attention to people that annoy you. That might become a character in a novel. So does it come from real life? Does it come from just your brain itself, a wellspring of creativity? Where do you find the continuing inspiration to come from?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because I think the challenge, especially for your audience, or for writers, like when people are aspiring to write, is they're kind of looking for, quite naturally looking for a sort of a code, right? Like, okay, if you take this plus this and do this, then you'll end up with this result. And writing is the one field where that doesn't work at all. You could follow, you can follow George R. R. Martin's exact process to the letter, and you'll and get nowhere. You can follow Stephen King's exact process to the letter and get nowhere. You can follow James Patterson's process, which is the
Mhm.
exact opposite of Stephen King's process, and get absolutely nowhere. Writing a novel is a journey through a dark forest for which no one else's path will work for you. You have to find your own. And even for me, as someone who's been doing this for about a decade now, which is not as long as lots of other people, but I've been quite fortunate in that time, and got to travel the world and have my book translated into 16 languages and all those good things. And yet every novel is a dark forest, and I have to find the
Mm,
path through for that one. But the good part of that is it also means you can fail it 15 different ways, right? You can take an MFA and do everything your instructors tell you and completely fail at it. And then you can leave and you can read Save the Cat, famous book about writing. You follow every step and completely fail at it. You can try all these different ways and fail, and it in no way means you're going to fail as a novelist. It just means you haven't found your path yet. And so my challenge with every novel, including the novel I'm working on now, Our Lady of Blades, which is a book that's incredibly important to me, but I've been spending 6 years on writing this damn book. And I, have written a lot of novels where the essential book was written first in a month. And so maybe I'll talk about that process a little bit, because that might be more concretely helpful. But every time I have to ask myself, how do I get through this? Right.
mm,
And the key is not to beat your head against the wall. It's not to toughen up or any of that kind of stuff that I think people impose upon themselves. You have to kind of experiment with curiosity and find your way through, and just keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. You will eventually get there. But you asked about sort of where ideas come from, and that itself is one of those big secrets that we think we know the answer to, because I can tell you in reverse. If I can tell you the themes of Malevolent Seven and what makes it an interesting book, and I can tell you in reverse, and this is what I was thinking of when I wrote it. But it's a construction. It's like all memory is reconstruction, right? It's not what we actually thought at the time. It's what we're explaining to ourselves we must have thought at the time. So I can tell you what I must have thought at the time, but is that really what was happening, or was it that I ate a bad bowl of cereal? But I would put it this. But generally, when I'm working with other writers, if I sit down with another writer, and I do this very often, right? I have friends who are novelists. I'll go, let's write a short story in an hour together, and we'll just do alternating 5-minute sprints while the other person's cleaning up what the person who's writing has written. We'll just sort of alternate like that. And I'll always just start out by saying, like, what are you thinking about the world lately? What's bugging you? And so somebody might say, I feel like everybody's a sucker today. Everybody just buys into whatever they're hearing, right? And regardless of where anybody's coming from politically, you can ignore that and go, okay, well, what does that look like in let's say, a fantasy world or a science fiction world? What would everybody being a sucker and following along without thinking look like?
mhm.
Because that feeling of, I feel like everybody's a sucker these days. I feel like everyone's following things without thinking. That's the creative impulse. And now you just need to go, okay, well, let's translate that into whatever genre you want to write. Let's say you want to write romance. You might
Yeah.
go, imagine a romance novel, but where it's constantly looking like everybody's falling in love, but they're not. They're just miming what they're seeing on TikTok or something. And so our main character is someone who thinks there's something wrong with them because they just can't seem to fall in love the way everyone else is constantly falling in love. But that's because they're ultimately trying to genuinely fall in love. And that would be an interesting story because
Mm.
it's not an idea sort of randomly imposed on a writer. It's a writer going, I have this feeling that's bugging me, and I'm going to translate that
Mm.
into a story. And the best part of it is that you get to the end of writing the novel and suddenly you know what you think, you know what you feel. It's like an exploration of what's going on inside of you.
Interesting. So I'm curious then about since you said you can't really follow what somebody else has done, regardless of how famous and how well they've sold books,
Mhm.
can teaching writing actually occur, or does it happen from within to come out? So is it an external or internal process?
It's both. There is absolutely nothing wrong with following a tried and true process because it's a way to try to do it. And it may not get you all the way there, but it will help. It'll help give you clues to find the thing within you. So for about a decade, I taught at a really wonderful entertainment school called Vancouver Film School, where and at one point I was the head of the digital design program. So it's the designers, and at one point I took over the film program. It's all of these filmmakers. I've worked with game designers. I've worked with actors there. And so I've seen all these different forms of trying to educate people in different types of arts. And it is a constant process of creating pedagogy whose only purpose is to try to awaken something in someone, not to mold them necessarily, not to shape them, not say, listen, because I know how to do this, now you're going to be a miniature version of me. It's I've been through this dark forest. Let me tell you the different ways. Let's try different ways other people go through this forest so that each student will ultimately awaken in themselves a sense
Mm.
of, oh no, that doesn't work. Oh, that's crap. Oh, wait a second. What if I try this? And then suddenly they're able to write their first novel, or they're able to make a design that's really fascinating, or deliver a performance as an actor. Like actors, I think, are good analogs for writers in a way, because actors are constantly creating story. It's just on a level that we think they're delivering the lines from a script, right? We think that the script says they're supposed to play an angry cop, and so they're okay, they're going to be angry and they're going to deliver these lines and hit these marks. But in fact, for them, they're having to tell this completely different story on the inside, right? So it's
Yeah,
that awakening process. So I think writing education and writing coaching and all these things, they can all be tremendously valuable. You just have to recognize as the student that ultimately you are going to be the one who's going to
right.
create a process, right?
Sure.
Because only your synapses are, following the paths that they follow. And so we're all coming to this thing as very different people, which is what makes it very hard when a lot of people, I'm sure you've encountered this, are just like, look, just tell me how to write a novel. I just want to write a novel. I just want to write a hit novel. I just want to replicate what somebody successful has done. And I will tell you, I'm a pretty experienced writer at this point, and I can't do it. If you can show me a book, you can show. So romantasy is a genre of fantasy that's very popular right now, right? It's basically fantasy romance, heavy on the romance, lots of sexual context and stuff like that, and it's very, very popular. And you can show me the tropes, and you can tell me here's exactly how it works, and I've got all the skills, Mick. I've been at this a while. I know how to write the prose. I know how to hit the plot points. I can't do it. And it's not because I look down on the genre. It's not because there's anything wrong with it. It's because it's not me, right? And I
Mhm.
can I can only write what's me and have it be worth anything. If I try to
Sure.
write like anybody else, I'm just going to do a bad job of it. And I'm only good enough as a writer to write myself the best way I can.
Now, I'm gonna have to really borrow this phrase, the dark forest, because I really love that image. So I'm curious then, because we're talking to writers and aspiring writers, could you give some actionable tips to say, how does one navigate that dark forest? What would you recommend?
Well, the first one is just don't stop trying. But I think one of the things that's helpful is put yourself in the mind of a really experienced writer who who meets tons of would-be writers, aspiring writers. So I meet lots of aspiring writers. I'm sure you do as well. And we have the conversations with them. They say, because they want to hear what it's like. They want this conversation we're having, but at a coffee shop somewhere. And I meet with lots of new writers, and they'll talk about how much they want to write, and they'll talk about that they have all these ideas in their head and they want to get them all out. And I'll try to spend a little bit of time with people and try to help them if I can. But I know that the saddest thing is that most of them just won't do it.
True.
The cost of entry into this club, if what you want is to be in this club, and it's not for everybody, but the cost of entry is an 80,000 word manuscript or 100,000 word manuscript. That's the price of admission into the game. You're nowhere until you've done it, and so you got to do it somehow. And just recognizing that, just remembering that all of the thoughts about, oh, is this idea good enough? No, wait, this idea is better. Wait, what if I do this instead? What if I map out a 12-book series before I write a single word? What if I rewrite this scene 42 times? Those things are all fine. You're welcome to do them. I do them sometimes myself. But nothing counts until you've put the manuscript, on the desk with all of those pages. And so it's realizing that that's the price of admission. After that, after that, all the conversations in the world about, is this idea good enough? Is this the right dialogue? They can all happen, but they all happen on the other side of the forest. And you got to get through that forest first, no matter what you have to do to get there. And so I think that's really important. In terms of how to get through the forest, the one piece of advice I usually give, there's a classic piece of writing advice, which is write the book you most want to read. And that is honestly really good advice, because, Trader's Blade, my debut novel, was the book I most wanted to read. It had the sword fights and the swashbuckling and the romantic idealism and the things that bothered me about the world. There's every idea I had, kind of put together in that way. The one thing I would add to that classic axiom is the word boldly. Write the book you most want to read boldly. Because one of the things I see happening, because one of the beauties of living in, today, and you and I are both, gentlemen of a certain age, that when we were really young, there just wasn't anything like the volume of material out there on how to write. You couldn't just walk into a bookstore and find 50 books on how to write. There weren't 500 online courses you could take. There wasn't 8 million YouTube videos. There's all this wonderful material out there that's there for you. But the problem with all of that material is it tends to lead you to hear a certain kind of chatter that tends to be about being original and being really good, and what's wrong and which tropes are out of date. All the things I remember I said, even as a really experienced novelist, that made me have to write Malevolent 7, made me have to blurt out a novel just for me, just to break through the noise. So that noise is there. And so one of the results of that is, if you're someone who read or watched Twilight, for example, and you thought, oh, I love this. This is what I love. I want to write sparkly vampires falling in love, right? You'll very quickly hear people going, oh, Twilight's really problematic. And oh God, sparkly vampires. Like, it's so just gauche and passe and unhip. And so what happens is you start going, oh, well, I don't want my book to be uncool. I better not make them very sparkly, even though that's what I love, but I better tone that down. I better make it darker. I better make it more cynical. I better make it all these things. And what you end up doing is watering down your manuscript before anybody's ever read it. And so now you're sending a manuscript to an agent that is basically a 300-word apology, right?
Yeah.
It's basically you apologizing for liking sparkly vampires or for liking romance. So you have to push yourself to go the exact other route. If you like sparkly vampires, you got to write the most sparkly vampires. You got to make the biggest romance, the most crazy, love infused, bizarre. This doesn't make sense in our world, but what the hell? I'm doing it because I love it. Because that's the only way your manuscript is really going to stand out. A skilled editor, can fix all of your foibles to some degree. They can always bring you back down. but they can't push you out enough. So there's a one of the books that really kind of was at the, I think the apex of the romantasy phase that we're in now. It's called Fourth Wing, and it's not my cup of tea, but boy, everything about romance and fantasy and sexual tension that you could imagine, she just puts in there, right? There's no apologies in that book. It takes everything to 11. And that, I think, is what works. And it was the same for me when I, even as a pretty experienced writer, I wrote Malevolent 7 and I just took everything to 11, and I didn't care. And then all of a sudden you discover that you've written something that actually people read and go, okay, well, this feels like, all right, this is worth taking a chance on. So write the book you most want to read as boldly as you possibly can.
Awesome. Just completely off the track, Patrick. It's a famous quote from Martin Luther, who said, "When you sin, sin boldly." Kind of reminds me of that. Just go for it. That's the point. So a different track on it, but kind of makes sense. Sebastien, thank you so much for taking some time out. You got a wealth of knowledge about writing and publishing and everything else. And I'm sure people now would like to know, if they haven't heard of you before, where do you find your books? What should they do? Who are the publishers? Tell us how to get in touch with you and getting a hold of the books.
Sure. So my books are in all the major bookstores that you would encounter books in. The Greatcoat series was my first series. That's still being published. The Spellslinger series is a young adult fantasy series. That's still out there. My latest books are Malevolent 7 and Play of Shadows, which came out last year, or sorry, earlier this year. I'm published by Hachette, which is one of the big five, for one series, and another publisher called Bonnier, which is a British publishing outfit from a Swedish conglomerate. And then, of course, it's published in different languages around the world. So, you end up, this is one of the things that's fun. One of the most fun things when you're a novelist is if your books get translated into, German and Ukrainian and Hebrew and, Arabic and Spanish and French, because you get to just see all these different people in publishing, and it's awesome. Just a incredibly wonderful experience. I recommend it to everyone. As far as finding me, the easiest way to find me is on my website, which is decastell.com. That's DECASTELL.com. I'm pretty easy to find. If you Google me, even if you misspell it, you'll probably get there, because fortunately enough, people have misspelled my name that it shows up. And I have a contact form on my website. I answer every email that I get.
Awesome.
I don't always get to answer it right away, but I always get there sooner or later. So if somebody has something they want to ask, I'm happy to try to answer for them.
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much, because it's really a wealth of knowledge, an actual working, successful person in writing, and it's really inspiring for a lot of people to hear your success stories. Thank you for being my guest today. Much obliged.
Thank you, Mick.
You bet. So if you like what you're hearing, and I certainly hope that you do, make sure that you are liking, subscribing, positively reviewing the Dr. Digital podcast. We talk about writing and writing better. I also want to thank the supporters of the program. That is the publishers of both Burning America and On Track, Ian Hunter. And I've got some other books coming along your way as well, too. So thank you for the support. If you want to reach out to me, easy to find, the Idea to Author Coach on Facebook, guiding your journey from draft to best-selling author. I help people publish books. I help people write books. And if you need some assistance, reach out to me on Facebook. Easy to find. Glad to talk to anybody, and we'll definitely answer all of your questions as well. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate the support of everybody and your listeners. You've got a lot of choices in life, and you decided to spend some time with me. Thank you for being here. Until the next time, this is Dr. Digital signing off. Deus Vult.